I am pleased this morning to have the opportunity to moderate a panel on the National System for Geospatial Intelligence. Executive Order 12333 establishes that there should be functional managers for the intelligence disciplines, and the director of NGA is then directed to be the leader of the NSG. There are a number of responsibilities that come along with that, and the NSG is somewhat young, as is the GEOINT discipline. So we want to share with you this morning is sort of an opportunity to observe and interact and understand where in the lifespan of the NSG, where in the evolution of the NSG we stand today. And I've got some great panelists to talk about it, so I'd like to welcome them to the stage now. The first panelist is Mr. Robert Cardillo, the Director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. He's followed by Dr. Steve Fleming, who is a professor working in our program, a GEOINT program at the University of Southern California. Dr. Joe Fontanella is the Director of the Army Geospatial Center. Dr. Suzette Kimball is working with the Civil Applications Committee, and Major General Bill Riddell is the Adjutant General for the state of New Hampshire and also carries a portfolio with respect to GEOINT, Geospatial, and Cyber for the National Guard. Please have a seat. So I've got a question that I think I'll throw out to everybody to start. We heard from the ASG members yesterday that trust was a central theme, that they feel their ability to come together as a group, their ability to communicate, has developed trust which is completely vital to their ability to accomplish the mission. So I'd be interested in your opinions on how the NSG has served to help develop that trust over time. Bill?
So it's no longer, in my eyes, a technology issue. It's a people, process, and trust issue. And I think when you look at the primary members, the associate members, and the way that they all come together, it's helping in the trust. But one of the things I'm really guarded against is when you look at the whole and when you look at how often people move, it's really hard to build trust when you're in a job at 2.7 years. So I'm hoping that the military as a whole might look at maybe we need to leave somebody in a position so that they can build trust.
Suzette?
Well, I think as the director of the Civil Applications Committee, we have a responsibility to serve the mission requirements of the civil agencies. And I think in the past there's been a perspective that the civil agencies sit on one side of a gulf and the intelligence community, military, DoD sits on a different side. One of the things that the NSG has made possible by welcoming the civil community as a member sitting at the table is that we have an opportunity to bridge that gulf and to be able to really develop the trust and the understanding of needs and requirements across the entire sector of the federal government, across all mission areas. And I think that that's been a very, very important accomplishment of the past decade, to be able to move forward so that we're working in concert in that way. So I agree with our colleagues from yesterday that trust is important, and having a forum where we can sit at the table and talk honestly about various needs and requirements is one way to really put a face to specific individual agency requirements.
Joe?
Yeah, so, I mean, blast to the obvious, the world's a big place. The mission is very, very complicated. There are a number of inherent dependencies that have been created over time just by the advancement of technology. Both inside members' formations, inside for the Army, for example, we're dependent upon PMs and projects happening on time, because if they don't, there's a downstream effect and a domino effect. So we're at a point right now where with limited resources, we'll never have enough. We have to rely on each other's best practices to adopt them instead of continuing to reinvent them. And I think we also need to understand the interdependencies in which each component or each part of the membership are doing. Because something that happens, as Suzette mentioned in the Civil Applications Committee, has a downstream effect on other activities. And something that fails to happen in these places has a downstream effect. So it's absolutely essential that we not only trust each other, but we have a clear understanding of those relationships that we have and how we depend on each other. And I think the NSG is a vehicle by which those things are brought to light. It's a governance process that helps us understand where our problems are, where our strengths are, and where our weaknesses are, and how we move to those strengths and take better advantage of each other's capabilities.
Steve?
So I'll approach the question from the academic side of the house and represent trusting our knowledge and what we know. So there's a great quote from Admiral Stavridis. He said, "It's all just high school, it keeps repeating itself." And there's a lot of truth in that statement, and it's the understanding that you might not know something at the very beginning, but in rapid, short order, you can very quickly become an expert. And you will continue to do this again and again and again in your life. Through your college years, through your professional life, you will continue to repeat high school again and again and again. And so this idea of a very dynamic discipline, and it was talked to yesterday with understanding how to trust our knowledge, that they're experiencing the same things that we're experiencing here in the NSG. And that is being able to very rapidly keep up with the knowledge requirements of the discipline. And in doing that, we'll have to trust ourselves and our abilities to trust what we know at the points along the way to where, again, the ability to very rapidly get knowledge, understand how to employ that knowledge as part of the system, helps develop trust not only in ourselves but in each other and ultimately in our organizations that work together.
Robert?
So, everything. The panel just said, I couldn't agree more with Bill that there was a time when we could hide behind this topic by our technology or lack thereof, right? Well, I can't partner with you because we're on different networks, or we have different classification levels, or we have different systems. Get over that, right? So now you got to deal with this question, and I do think it is, but here's where I think technology's not only allowed us to have this harder conversation, I think it's enabling an integration that just didn't exist before. I think we can unite and integrate around the data. We all need it. We all must share in it, and we all must find the meaning from it. So let that unite us. Keith, I think it's reasonable to remind people of the power of programs of certification. Mm-hmm. That gets to trust because it's terminology, it's understanding, it's confidence. I know what capabilities you have, even through a virtual connection we've never met, but I know you have this education or certification. And then finally, I think we just have to deal with the reality of the alternative. Should we choose not to, we'll all fail. And so it doesn't become an optional entity. We have to work through this.
So Joe, having been around at the time representing the Army in the establishment of NEMA and then the evolution into NGA and the beginnings of the NSG, at each of those steps there was concern by all the military services of a loss of autonomy. There was a lot of focus on all the things that there were to lose by buying into this concept. I guess if you could just share a little bit on your view on the opportunity space associated with, for the Army, for the services afforded by the NSG.
So, I told Keith earlier I was going to answer the question I wanted to answer rather than the one he might ask me, but I will answer his question. So, I think you kind of have to put this into a context. There's a lot of value that is gained by the NSG all the way from the professionalization and accreditation and certification of the workforce to sharing of best practices, but I'd like to just kind of focus kind of narrowly on one thing that I think that the NSG has done to really help our formation. To put it a little bit in context, there's about 180 systems in the Army that consumer create geospatial information, or GEOINT. About 14 of those are kind of the big programs. And so one of our big challenges is, how do we connect all the way from national down to tactical? Robert talked yesterday about interoperability. Well, a lot of the heavy lifting of that has to happen kind of inside the NSG member formations. All the plumbing that has to be put together to ensure interoperability and a common view of the battle space, at least in the case of the Army, is really the work of the members. And so I mentioned that my view is that the NSG, through its governance bodies, the GEOCOM and the National System for Geospatial Intelligence Senior Management Council, kind of provide an overarching governance process that allows us to have an approach that kind of forces some compliance. So, one of the things that we've been concerned about really for the last 10 years is how do we ensure that everybody's operating off of the same stuff. So if you got 180 systems, multiply that times the number of users, there's an opportunity for a lot of soldiers, a lot of units to have a very different view of the same battle space that they're operating in. And so the way that you have to get at that problem set is you got to break down barriers. You've got to have standards. You've got to have ways to implement those standards. And you've got to have a certification process for those systems that make sure that things show up the way they're supposed to show up. Now, when you were in the Army and years ago, you remember the map boards and you had a sergeant major sitting in the brigade or division command post that said, you're not putting that overlay up because it doesn't meet 2025 standards. It's not compliant, okay? You have to do that digitally now. And one of the ways that we get at this is through partnership within and at the NSG to have what really belongs to Robert as his GEOINT functional manager standards assessment. So now we're building and we're providing guidance out to program managers, and we've got a compliance mechanism that says you've got to do this. That's the only way we're going to have interoperability. And to be able to communicate in a joint environment, that's got to be extended across the NSG. So, it's not glamorous work doing this stuff. If you've ever talked to somebody that builds data models, oh my gosh, they're really not usually interesting people, right? But it's really, really hard work. I know I'm sorry if I offended anyone. But it's hard work. It's got to be done, and it's not glamorous. But that's what enables this. And without an NSG to kind of provide overarching guidance and to referee issues, we've got no hope of having interoperability. And to the Army, and I think to the Joint Force, that's really, really key and important.
So Suzette, I think despite the long history of the CAC and the engagement with the civil community, the idea of the civil community being involved in the NSG through the lens of DOD and IC might have maybe been a polite invitation, right? To make sure that you were seated at the table, whatever that might mean. But I think your leadership has defined a process by which the civil community really has engaged, has leaned forward, has wanted to be a productive part of the NSG, to contribute and to draw from. I was wondering if you could maybe give some anecdotes or talk about why you felt so strongly about that.
Well, I would wager that probably 98% of the people that are sitting out there this morning heard about the Civil Applications Committee when you introduced me. That in fact, we are a well-kept secret. But we're a product of that initial launch into photo reconnaissance that the general so eloquently described earlier. And for the first 10 years in the 1960s, there was an ongoing debate about whether civil agencies had a right to access NTMs, whether they should be engaged in a meaningful way with the intelligence community and with the military. I'm actually pleased as a USGS employee to say that in 1969, the USGS developed a classified photo reconnaissance capability specifically to help what we called military geology, but to help the warfighter. But the entire issue actually came to a head and culminated in a presidential directive that President Ford issued in 1976. And that specified specifically that civil agencies had a right to access this information, and moreover, that it was essential to be able to have access to those kinds of information, analytics, and methods to execute the civil missions effectively. And since then, we've been, as I said, kind of a well-kept secret. But it's a group of 9 civil agencies at the department level and 9 of the IC and providers of NTMs that sit together on a monthly basis. And what that has done is it has allowed us to identify needs and requirements that are important to the civil community, but also to be able to have a dialogue about the kinds of assets that can be most useful as future directions are identified, not just within the NGA, but across the community as a whole. But on the flip side, it's not one-sided. On the flip side, civil agencies have a lot of capabilities that can enhance the information that is collected, developed, and disseminated to help the warfighter. I think one really good example is the work that's going on in the civil community to advance analytics associated with hyperspectral data and the acquisition of hyperspectral data. The specific and very detailed information that comes from those data sets has enormous impact on the ground. Similarly, the expertise that the civil agencies provide in natural hazards understanding, things like landslides, potential for seismic activities that are enhanced by having access to NTMs, can also provide that kind of information that can provide safety for military operations on the ground. Having something like the NSG for the USGS as a single agency, for the CAC representing 9 civil agencies, to be able to sit at the table and have the dialogue. A word that came up across the panel was understanding. To be able to really understand what those needs are and to be able to put that together with the kinds of research and development capabilities that are within the civil community is an enormous benefit to the American taxpayer as a whole. Similarly, not just having the seat there, but the ability of the civil agencies to understand what goes on across that gulf really helps us become cohesive as the U.S. government. It helps us to be able to address key issues associated with partnerships, whether that's partnerships with academia, with industry, with other agencies. So yes, I have felt very strongly that the benefits to be derived by having the civil agencies have a seat at the table, be engaged in the discussion, is going to be very important for our future direction, especially as Bill acknowledged, technology is out there. The rest of this is about people and about those relationships. And being able to develop those relationships, I think, makes all of our jobs a little bit easier when you can pick up the phone and say, I've got a problem, can you help? And there's somebody on the other end who answers that phone call.
Thanks, Suzette. General Riddell, Bill, we were talking before the panel, and we seemed to get stuck at the policy level and some interoperability levels, and you kind of leaned forward and said, hey, this is about mission. So if you could describe, through your lens, through your set of responsibilities as an adjutant general in a state, and thinking more broadly, what the mission consequences of the NSG.
Well, first you got to look at the Guard, and the Guard is warfighter, homeland, and building partnerships. So when I look at the NSG and I look at what they do as far as building the geospatial, the GEOINT for the away game more than the home game, in my view, I think it's outstanding. So that covers the warfighter. When I start looking at the homeland, almost everybody on the NSG, primary and associate, I work with. And then when I look at cyber, it's the same list, except that associate list is even bigger. We have to deal with man-made and natural disasters. And that information is going to start from the local first responder and work its way up into the federal side of the house. And the issue is a lot of our local first responders, states, don't know what good looks like. So I need the NSG to help show them what good looks like, help build the standards, trying to have, for the Guard, there's 54 different solutions, 50 states, 3 territories in the District of Columbia. I can't have one-offs. I need the NSG to help me with that too. For the National Guard, when you look at domestic ops, we are the military first responders for the United States. In fact, 98% of the time, it's the National Guard that's out there doing it in a non-federalized status. So I can't always go to the feds and say, okay, give me this stuff, although it should be coming freely. And a lot of people say, well, you need to push the data to me. And I'm like, no, I'm going to put it out in the cloud and you're going to pull from that. I don't have time to push. And I think that's where the NSG can also help out.
Thanks, Bill. Robert, we have a question for you from the audience about what efforts are underway to increase NSG members' participation in the development of the NGP program. Will services and other members be able to participate in fora where the program is built and adjudicated?
I think there's 2 parts to the answer. One is to pick up on what I mentioned in my remarks yesterday, which is the elevation of Dustin's position in my agency. He's my associate director. He sits at my table every day for every meeting I have of any import about the community, and so his voice is there constantly. I will tell you, we need to figure out how we cascade his voice, because as much as I like to think everything happens from my office at NGA, I realize that it doesn't. And so we're working now as to how to elevate Dustin's voice in our program build to make sure he's at the right table representing that community first perspective. So that's half the answer, and I think we're on the right path, and I think you should expect to see us do more to elevate that position effect. On the other side, and by the way, I take no credit for this, I think Joe, quite frankly, and his colleagues on the GEOCOM have re-energized, restructured, and created a better outcome from the GEOCOM because they took ownership. GEOCOM will work if you just come to the meeting, but it'll work as much as you just invested in it, because we'll tend to pontificate and then we'll just shoo you away, invite you back in a month or 2. Now, the owners of the GEOCOM, while I chair, via Dustin, are the members. And so the action elements, whether it's standards, whether it's training, whether it's certification, whether it's architectural or investments, they own that. And so I think between those 2, Keith, if I could get those 2 to meet better, I think you'll see more and more of the NGP reflecting the NSG.
So the next question goes to NSG governance, and we've touched on it a little bit. We talked earlier about a relatively recent re-examination of the GEOCOM that resulted in some changes. So this question is for anyone on the panel. Do there need to be any changes to NSG governance? And if so, what would you suggest?
I vote for Joe to speak.
Well, first of all, I'd like to go on record saying that my experience is that data models are fun at a party. I don't understand them usually when I'm talking to them in a work setting. But to answer your question, yes, I think it's very important to have a governance process. Inside the Army about 8 years ago, we stood up a governance process. We're bringing the 3 stars across the R staff and the membership across the Army major commands. And we take on real issues. It's a board that actually does work and assigns tasks. And behind all of that process, we have a group of folks that meet every couple weeks at the action officer level, and it's not a coffee klatch. They actually take on problem sets and work towards a set of objectives. One of the things that we've done internally is to redefine our objectives and goals in a way that kind of follows a SMART paradigm. You know, what are the timelines? Are they measurable? Are they achievable? And so on and so forth. And we check that stuff off to make sure that it moves forward. I would say that, you know, having co-chaired a GeoComp subcommittee for a couple of years and then sitting on the GeoCom and having gone to NSMCs for years, what I'm seeing is a move towards an environment where there's just a lot of information briefing to an environment where we're making decisions and where hard decisions are getting put on the table and where roses are getting pinned on people to go work on those and come back and report. That's a sea change that I think is very, very, very important if we're to work together. There's a lot of work to be done. You know, Robert talked yesterday about analytic modernization. That's a big task that's being taken on. It's not just an NGA task, it's a task that we all share. There's a cost to doing it. There's going to have to be a realignment of resources to make that happen. There are impacts downstream as a result of that. And, you know, naturally we need to think about bridging strategies. This is hard work. And I think it's very important that there is a more rigor applied, or an increased rigor. I would say we are applying rigor now to that whole process that kind of elevates all of this up to a kind of a common enterprise approach to getting the things done that need to be done.
Two things. One, the numbers I put up yesterday on our certification program, for which we're quite proud, a good chunk of those numbers are from Joe's team. The Army has been extremely active and extremely aggressive in moving out. So I think that's a great reality of what we're trying to achieve. Another answer to your question, Keith, is something we've not talked about much because we're just stepping out into it. And this is NGA and the NSG building off DNI Clapper's move to mission management, the stand-up of the National Intelligence Managers, which is sustained and quite effective under DNI Coates now. So NGA, while we've always been supportive of the mission management, felt like, well, maybe we could apply that model on a smaller scale for our community. So we're moving out under General UV, my director of operations, to create similar type structures. And so we announced them and competed them lightly. Not that we didn't want competition, but we knew that we would probably need to take the first step. We have the most resources and whatnot. I believe we will be in a much better place when I have an Army professional, the head of my mission management shop, when I have a Navy professional running, and an Air Force or a civil member running, you know, the homeland effort. We need to prove out the case that this is worth investing your people in, but I think that's another part of the governance that's to come, and it speaks right to our mission.
Bill, you brought up cyber, and that's part of your portfolio, because I guess GEOINT for the whole guard isn't enough. How have you been able to maybe learn lessons from what the NSG is doing to apply back to the cyber community, or have you seen things that the cyber community has done that you've been able to port back over to the NSG?
Well, they kind of go hand in hand, because when we look at a cyber event, there's a virtual problem which might turn into a kinetic problem. And when I first started going into the cyber side, I'm like, well, how are you mapping where these attacks are coming from? How are you mapping the effects of the cyber attack? And I just pointed back to the NSG and said, hey, these folks are doing great work over in there. You should consider it. They've dipped their toe into the water, but they're really not there yet. It's still going to be a common push. Where we always use the NSG, though, is the kinetic or the man-made disaster from a cyber event. And it could be huge. And when you look at the National Guard, we could be actually going to both sides. We're going to the cyber side with our cyber warriors, and then everybody else is taking over on the man-made or natural disaster side. I think they just have to talk more between the two of them, between the NSG and the cyber community, because I think there could be great roads that we could pave to get solutions.
We at the foundation have fostered some discussions on something we've termed the cyber location nexus, right? An observation that cyber is often depicted as this amorphous cloud, yet real servers sit in real buildings in real places and go to real switches, right? So location still matters, but it seems to get magicked away sometimes. Speaking of cyber, Robert, the NSA, the cryptologic community, had like a 40-year head start on this idea of functional management and the NSG with respect to NEMA and then NGA. So what have you been able to sort of build off, seeing how they've managed over time? And of course, as we discussed earlier, cyber's really kind of threw them for a loop a little bit. They had the cryptologic, SIGINT was on a path, and cyber introduced some challenges into it.
So I'll be briefer than this question deserves, because we have a panel to share, because we could have a whole panel on the analogy. I briefly mentioned it during Q&A yesterday about, I believe strongly that we're at that similar place. As the internet became the digital fabric of our planet and connected humans in a whole different way, it clearly cascaded both positively and negatively into our SIGINT colleagues. To your point, shame on us if we don't use the lessons learned here about what they went through and are still going through to affect the outcomes that we must achieve, or respect the privacy that we equally owe an obligation to do, and yet create the common effect that we seek and we must achieve. So I think, at least for me in my seat, what I've taken away from the SIGINT analogy is the outsized importance of terminology and standards. Again, to my remarks yesterday, that as you do that outreach, you have to equally weigh your own security. And this is our push, our elevation of GEOINT assurance and all that entails, because we not only owe those who rely upon us advantage, we also owe those customers a better definition of the threat that they're exposed to because of this better connected, in my vernacular, better sensed world. And so, and I'll finish with this. I think the other thing is we should acknowledge now, or all acknowledge, that I don't know where this is going. And I mean this in the large sense. I mean, there's a huge commercial market being defined and developed as we speak. There's a growing academic field that is fleshing out the opportunities here. So my interest is to build in flexibility and agility, so that knowing that we will make suboptimal decisions because we won't know the answers. So I think SIGINT has broadly done that. I think they created conversations that didn't exist before. And I'm a big believer that if we have a common frame of reference, which GEOINT is quite good at doing, we can either come to agreement or at least agree to disagree, but then at least we know what we're disagreeing about.
Steve, what could academia uniquely contribute to the NSG if academia was more directly engaged? There's a new academic engagement officer at NGA. I'm not sure if that's precisely the right title, but if that person was at the table representing the centers of academic excellence, what types of things would you want them to enter into the process, enter into the discussion?
Yeah, I think the learning paradigms that many in the room grew up with was you go to class, you go into a lecture hall instead of a learning hall, and it was kind of one-way information. It was delivered. It was very procedural. It was actually very static. Those types of learning protocols don't work in a dynamic field. So, today we sit in the, talking about the NSG, the National System for, in this case, Geospatial Intelligence. There's a whole bunch of national systems out there. And how those national systems introduce education into their professionalism of the workforce likely are different than, say, how we would have to do it. But we're a very dynamic discipline. And so the idea of dynamic learning and how we've learned before, we have to, I think, change many of those protocols to keep up. There's a great quote out there by Alvin Toffler. He talked about the illiterate of the 21st century. He said, the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who can't read and write. It will be those that can't learn, unlearn, and learn again. And it's this idea that to keep up with, in this case, our field, we have to have protocols in place that allow us to learn either through educational institutions, as you articulated. There are organizations that are kind of setting the body of knowledge of what we need to know. But much of the body of knowledge, there's a baseline of what you have to have, and then there are the emerging technologies that we have to keep up with, and we have to figure out how to get that to the workforce so that we keep up with the technology that's being introduced to them, and it can be done through education and training environments. So online learning, classroom learning, these merged technologies that we now have the ability to do, we have to make sure that that's part of what we're doing with all of our schoolhouses, whether they be in the EDU world of institutions like University of Southern California, where I hang my hat today, or our military organizations, such as our service academies and certainly our training base. How we do that and bring that into the workforce is going to be, I believe, critically important to leverage, again, what I would call dynamic learning. And that's the thing I would ask that person to be able to do.
Joe?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to Steve's comment, because we have to kind of break this paradigm, at least in the services that we've undertaken with how we train on equipment, right? So new equipment training, you're done, right? And that doesn't work in this discipline. The Army's invested in a foundry program that goes out and trains folks, not just on new equipment, but on new software and new techniques and so on and so forth. We do the same thing at the Army Geospatial Center, but this is not a well-resourced approach. There's still this old paradigm that we have about where we train folks, where they get their initial training. Then when they go to their units, are we taking stuff out of the boxes? Are we getting them actually connected to the networks that they're going to use? And are we training them? Lieutenant General Legier, when she was a G2, she really pushed that to ensure that there was no GEOINT soldier at rest. So we really need a different training paradigm than kind of the paradigm, at least in the Army, that we've kind of grown up with in the Training and Doctrine Command. It's kind of fire and forget. There has to be a way that we refresh folks, especially those that have been away from the discipline and now returning to it. But also the advances in technology and tactics, techniques, and procedures is just growing. And you've got to find a better way to institute and share that learning across the workforce.
So, yeah, please.
And if I could build on what Steve and Joe have said, that we have a lot of training programs that train people how to operate the technology, how to access the software. But where I think academia has a really strong role in partnership in these endeavors is translating those data into information. What makes it useful? Understanding if you're talking about deploying in an unknown area, is what kind of understanding do you need about the natural processes in that area that's going to keep the warfighter safe and make the mission accomplishable. Is that a word? To be able to do that, those kinds of that kind of coursework is typically vested in our academic institutions, and being able to develop a mechanism to pull that forward in our training procedures, I think, is going to be able to strengthen the actual applicability of GEOINT across the board.
And I know a little bit more on the cyber world than the geospatial world, but for U.S. Cyber Command, they set the standards. They go to schools and say, you need to teach at these standards. And if you can pass the written test, show us your certificates, but we're going to give you a practical test, then we'll give you equivalency training credit. And I think I don't know if we do that as much on the geospatial world, but I think you could take lessons learned from the cyber world and throw it over, because it's a technology-driven solution.
So I want to thank the audience for excellent questions. I know already that we will not get to all of them. What I will do is we will have all these questions, and I will farm them out to you afterwards. We'll collect them, and then we'll post them to the USGIF website, because this is good stuff. So this is interesting. I'll paraphrase, but it sort of gets to the point of people building IEDs are probably not working to a standards document. They probably haven't had system engineering panels and review panels and funding fights, maybe funding fights. But how does a lengthy application of standards and architecture, a process facilitated by the NSG, it's good, but how can it possibly keep up with the speed of technology and allow us to move on some pace approximation, some approximation of the pace that our adversaries can move?
Okay, so it's not a disguised fact that the acquisition process is slow. One of the concerns I think sometimes we have with services is that it seems sometimes the IC actually is able to move out quite a bit quicker, and our concern has always been left behind. So we kind of have what we have, but we also have other mechanisms to get technology in the hands of folks kind of outside that. The quick response capabilities. We still have the QRCs that are in use in a variety of theaters. A very senior general officer once told me not to move one of our systems into a program of record, because then it would, I won't use the exact words he used, but he said then it would not be good anymore, right? So it's a real challenge to do that, but it's the system we have. And as I mentioned earlier, we talked about interdependencies. Well, at least in our service, there's a lot of interdependencies between all of these systems. And you got to remember, when we had the good idea that we really needed an enterprise approach to this in around 2008, the Army acquisition executive actually signed a letter that my predecessor was a recipient of that said, go out and talk to every program of record and make sure they're doing geospatial stuff correctly. I mean, it was a lot more flowing terms than that, but that's basically what the mission was. And I mentioned that's a lot of systems, right? So you're now impacting every single PM's cost production schedule when you do that. And so some of this became coalition of the willing. And here we are now through our common operating environment inside the Army, getting very close to realizing this stuff. It doesn't answer the question about how we do it quicker and better. We've got to have a better way to adopt technology quicker. We do have some means of doing it on a limited basis. But the fact is that unless we do it in a way that guides this development, and I would say this even should apply to QRCs, quick response capabilities. They've still got to be building the stuff to standards. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to share. And maybe there's a technology out there that could help solve all this problem, but we find we spend a lot of time still building translators so that this system can share with this system. Years ago, I joked with a CEO of a very large company. I said, if you could operationalize and geospatially enable PowerPoint, you'd be a billionaire. Well, he is, and he did, but that's kind of what we were doing for years, is taking stuff out of a system, putting it in PowerPoint, redigitizing it, and putting it in another one. We can't be doing that stuff. And so you've got to have a process across the whole framework of both new ideas and existing programs to build things in a way that we could be interoperable.
Mm-hmm. Keith, I appreciate the intent of the question, but I'd like to observe before I answer it that the people that are building IEDs seek to destroy and to fragment and disconnect. Our job is to do just the opposite, right? We're looking to build and to sustain something. So, but I get the point. So we shouldn't equate the two. One doesn't equal the other. Two, we have to do more to focus on the outcome that we seek. there are vendors in this room and in that hall that have solutions to the outcomes that I seek that don't meet my current standards. And I have teammates on my side that end the conversation there. We can't use it because it doesn't meet ... And my commitment to this room and to that conference hall is that I will continue to challenge that. I will continue to push that conversation forward. We do need standards, right? We do need to sustain. We do need to have interface definitions that allow me to share with every member of the panel. But just because it doesn't meet what we wrote 1, 5, or 10 years ago doesn't mean it can't work a different way. So I know this room will do it. I guess I want and need you to continue to challenge, but do it this way. Focus on the don't compare us to IED networks. Focus on the outcome that we seek. Show me and us how you will achieve that outcome a different way. And then be persistent, because we're the federal government and we will be hard and we will confuse and we will not reply to your first or second or third email. So you're going to have to be persistent.
An underlying tenet of the NSG is a belief that there could be mission sharing, right? That it's not all on NGA. There's a big team here. If any of the panelists have ideas on the sorts of things that they could see their respective communities taking on as part of the larger NSG mission, and kind of stepping up and saying, hey, I could see a path to where we could handle this and allow that burden sharing to become actualized. Bill, do you have anything comes to mind?
So when I look at how the NSG is formed, it's all about having resources to do the mission, and for the Guard, we don't have a lot of resources, but how do we get, especially for the homeland, how do we bring all those folks together so that we can push the data up, so it's good data, so NGA has a good qualified data set from the states, so it helps my job and at the end of the day.
Suzette?
Well, I think the civil community as a whole has a lot of experience in the analytical part of the system once an acquisition is made. And where the NSG is helpful is having a seat at the table and understanding what the needs are. But I think some of those analytical capabilities, I mentioned earlier the issue with hyperspectral and how that is a focus right now in the geophysics community, and how that could be capitalized on in order to be able to provide the kinds of tools that can be used to translate those data into usable information products. Another thing that the civil community has done for decades, of course, is the whole issue of education and training within the respective disciplines. And I think a partnership in that regard, a partnership in the credentialing and accreditation is something that could streamline activities, make things a little bit easier. It may not be possible to take it on wholesale from the various agencies within the IC, but I think a partnership can move that forwards. Those are a couple of ideas. I think there are quite a number of ways when you get down to the details of capabilities that the civil agencies have had to adapt to and to adopt in order to execute their missions, many of which is associated with being a first responder, natural hazard response, firefighting response. There are a lot of those kinds of extreme circumstances that the civil agencies have adapted to through the years that could be translated and to help the NSG community at large.
Joe?
Well, I would say, there's a centers of excellence kind of concept out there. There are many centers of excellence across the NSG. A couple examples in the Army. We probably do more LiDAR than most. We have some certain expertise in there. We have both academic and industry partners that are part of that kind of center of expertise. Consolidating PED is another kind of thing that the Army does pretty well. And I would suggest that I'm not sure that we have a phone book of where those centers exist and where those activities exist, where you have kind of a best practice. And we spend a lot of time, I think, collectively across our formation reinventing solutions to problems that we already have pretty good ones, or spending resources to kind of get across the top of that logarithmic curve where, a 90% solution is maybe good enough and the investment to get to 92 is, significantly greater. And I'm not sure we fully understand where those cut points are. Similarly, our industry partners are out there, working really, really hard to identify new problems. One of the challenges I think we have just in R&D is that we seem sometimes to be responsive to kind of a current set of requirements. And really what we ought to be thinking about is how do we use research and development to inform future requirements. And I'm not sure that we I don't think we've given people their head on this enough. I think we need to unleash a little bit of this, a little bit more, and get the feedback that is out there on, hey, there's a problem you don't even know you have yet, and let me kind of lay this out for you, and here are some potential solutions. And that's maybe a different approach that we don't put enough effort into.
Steve, recognizing sort of the absurdity of saying like academia is a cohesive whole, right? What could you envision a group, a gathering of academics coming together through research or what have you to contribute to take on as a part of the NSG?
Yeah, I think two things. One, we talk about best learning practices. So there's best teaching practices, which is instructor focused. Learning practices is focused on who's receiving the knowledge content. So I think right now in academia, we're much further ahead today about how students are learning. And that's not something that I don't know that we do real well right now within some of our learning schools that we have in the military or in our support agencies about how we learn properly. It's not that the effort's not there, it's just that there's much more, I think, to be offered by academia writ large on how students learn today. And so I think those best practices could be offered to the NSG and the places where we're trying to keep up with, in this case, the rapid knowledge requirements of the field. That's the first thing. The second thing, as you mentioned, this idea of what academia offers in the way of collaborative problem solving in the research and development area. I mean, they are designed and wired to bring together multidisciplinary solutions in academia to solve wicked problems. And that's a place where you kind of break away from stovepiping that sometimes is built within the R&D community of our services. And so academia, I think, offers that's unique in that way. And so that better relationship between academia and both on the corporate side as well as the government side to introduce some of those challenges. It's great to hear that we can now do more of that through unclassified requirements, that we can either take a classified issue and say, here's what it looks like, feels like, smells like, solve the problem, and then we take it and apply it behind the, kind of the Annex A to the thesis, if you will, what that then looks like in the way of a military solution that can then be translated. So I think academia has a great advantage there over some of the normal ways that we see research and development done in the military.
Can I add something quickly to the burden mission chair discussion? We're going to take a page out of the SIGINT book. I'm going to soon sign out, or General UV will sign out, a GEOINT reapportionment memo. Some of us can remember how well that went over. Because I have made some decisions to realign some of my resources from the mission I call analysis to other mission spaces within NGA, Sue Calwait is rogering up and going, got it, and here are missions that I won't be able to deliver with this set of resources, which is exactly what she should be doing. Now we need to coordinate this, right? That's another lesson we learned from our SIGINT brethren. before we land. But to me, the reality that NGA's resources are not unlimited and that we need to focus on what we can, I think will then propel the conversation into a real space. Does the nation need that account covered? Can we afford it as a collective? If not, maybe an ally can help us out here. So we're going to prompt this discussion quite soon.
So I'll conflate a couple of questions here. The story of this is post 9/11, we were in a relatively certain funding environment with the open checkbook. Sequestration rolled in, we were in a pretty clear funding environment where flat was the new up, right? We're in the first year of a new administration, a change of party in the White House. How is today's climate impacting the ability of the NSG to sort of work together when there's a lot of uncertainty with respect to funding and areas of responsibility, and have you felt any pressures to that in that regard?
I'll start.
Good.
I've been in flat as the new up for some time. I'm more optimistic than that. I think there's an opportunity in this environment for us to propose and defend and compete for additional resources. I think it's in the realm of possibility. No guarantees. This is not going to be handed to us like in the good old days. We're going to have to work for it. But I think the opening is there, Keith. And I sense that from the Hill, from the support that I've gotten in both hats. And I sense it from the administration. So again, I don't want to get expectations out of alignment here, but I'm in a different mental place than I was just a year ago.
I see everybody else is eager to touch that one.
Well, so believe it or not, the House and the Senate do have staffers that get together that talk about GEOINT. And I've talked to them quite a bit. And one of the things that I push is, why do Fortune 500 companies have a GeoCell and a data cell embedded in their organizations? Because it affects the bottom line. So why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we pushing more resources into GEOINT, which could actually save us money, plow some of that money back into the enterprise as a whole, but get a better return on investment?
This is a good question. Understanding you all been busy in meetings, we probably had an opportunity to walk around and hear some of the discussions so far. What takeaways or action items have you gleaned from this week, this event, that will help improve the NSG going forward, sort of through your lens? Have you seen anything?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've seen, I spent a good bit of day yesterday with some industry partners, some people we're doing business with, some that we would like to do or they would like to do business with us. And the thing that I think that I am most impressed with is industry is really interested in solving problems. And I've talked to some folks and great employees that are working for these companies because they're interested in solving problems. That's why they're there. And my experience over the last couple of years is that industry is very willing to respond in meaningful ways to some of the challenges we have. And I think part of our responsibility as leaders to kind of help shape, I don't want to call it industry behavior, really industry response to not only current requirements, but emerging requirements. I see a lot of interest in doing that. And we've got some great partners that are doing this, and I've got a notebook full of follow-on engagements that I think we need to follow up on. I think part of our due diligence is a look under the hood of a lot of these technologies that are out there. And I think part of our due diligence is also, as Robert alluded to, is to help industry understand kind of what they need to do to make it easier and to do business with them. So he mentioned the standards, authorities to operate, certificates of networthiness, all those types of things are things that we now have to live with in this kind of heightened cyber environment. And I think it's important for us to communicate, some of the challenges we have as federal managers to do business with them. And I think kind of my takeaway is that we need to have a lot of follow-on discussions as a result of this.
Other thoughts?
I think that one of the difficulties that's faced, or challenges that's faced by many of us in the discretionary end of the budget, is that it's really difficult to take the kind of risk that's necessary to be truly innovative. And walking around the exhibit hall, I've seen a lot of examples of real innovation, of people talking about how do you take technology today and transform it into something that's going to answer questions that are 10 years or 20 years out that we haven't really thought about addressing yet. And like I said, the discretionary federal budget process doesn't really support that kind of an approach. And that really draws us to how can we more effectively interact with industry, especially with those industries where innovation is, in fact, their mission. And I don't have any answers. There's not an easy answer for how do you make that intersection work effectively. But I think innovation and risk-taking is something that we can really learn to work effectively in partnership arrangements. And like I said, I see that in many, many different ways when I walk around the exhibit hall.
I guess the bottom line for me is it can't be personality driven. When I look at the whole NSG as a whole, it's just got to be the standard operating procedure that we all get together, we share data, we share new ways of doing business. More often than not, I see it as a personality driven process, and it's got to go beyond that.
Keith, and I credit the industry in the showroom this year. This is my third one in this chair. So that's just 2 years ago. We were in Washington, and the amount of cloud-based, app-based, light touch, right, openly available, non-proprietary solutions like night and day. I'm exaggerating, but it seemed like everything I was trying to be sold 2 years ago was a box. Mm-hmm. You know, hey, I got this in a box, and I got this in a box, and if you just buy this box and hook it on, you'll be good. I got this app, I got this browser-based capability, it's light, it's cloud, it's C2S approved. So kudos on the room for moving quite quickly to the environment we have to be in. Here's what I'm not seeing. Of course, I made this demand signal quite recently, but where's the automation? Now I know I got by Space No yesterday, great. I know Orbital Insight, I know there are other players, but that's what I hope to see, is, you know, automate, augment those human tasks that we're doing today, you know, lift us up to where we need to be.
So connected to that, and putting you on the spot maybe a little bit, but there's a question about industry representation on the GeoCom, and I know that there was some discussion of that during the re-examination, and I'm not sure precisely how it played out, but I'm not sure that there is an industry voice on the GeoCom, and just some thoughts about that from your perspective.
I know this is going to sound like me in front of the Senate, you know, when it's uncomfortable. Can I take this for the record? But seriously, Keith, I had not thought about it. So I was not involved in that debate if we had one. I don't know, Joe, do you know anything about?
No, not really.
Okay. Can we take it?
Yes.
That'll be one of the questions we'll answer later.
And I was involved, so I'd love to talk to you.
Can you write it for me, Keith?
That's why I was happy to take this. And I just editorialize and say, right, there should be somebody, and how we adjudicate it and how we manage it, and how I think the if is probably yes, and the how is a little stickier, right?
My non-answer was not a no, Keith. It was a non-answer.
No, I know. I'm happy with not an answer over no. Suzanne, this is interesting the way it's articulated, but it gets to the idea of, hey, is there a downside to having the civilian agencies move closer and closer and get involved in the GeoCom? With the upside you've articulated very clearly. Are there any cons to it? Is there any problems that you've encountered because of the relationship?
I wouldn't say that there are problems, but when you say, you know, is there a downside? Built into the CAC charter is a very, very strong statement about making sure that the civil agencies that sit at the table do not become the CIA, do not become the FBI. We are not law enforcement. We are not a group of intelligence agencies. And so while there's an incredible amount of synergy that can be gained by working together on problems that are common problems, we want to make sure that in accessing this kind of information that there is no perception that the civil agencies are moving into spying on people, spying on organizations. Similarly, we want to make sure that the civil agencies are really perceived as staying within their mission lane, that having access to these conversations and access to this kind of information enhances the basic mission responsibilities and is not stepping out and assuming a role that is not part of that core mission. And that's something that we guard jealously. The procedures that are in place for requesting taskings, requesting various pieces of information, whether that be commercial imagery or NTMs, are very explicit in making sure, the review process is very explicit in making sure that we don't become perceived as having those other kinds of functions that rightly sit within the intelligence community. And so it's something that we're, I'd say, kind of constantly on watch for. But being at the table, being able to have the conversations is a really good thing. It really, I think, strengthens both the provider side and the user side of the table. But the challenge is to make sure that the civilian agencies don't engage in a mission creep that's inappropriate.
So our goal today was to have this panel to raise the idea of the NSG off the page of its foundational documents and its very formal charter and the idea of the GEOCOM and share some insight another level deeper. So you can understand that you all would walk out of here with an increased appreciation for the roles, the missions, the engagement of the various players on the NSG.